This is ILM Circle, a learning workshop presented by the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, or ISBA. ILM stands for Intentional Learning for Mutual Respect, the foundation of what ISBA is all about.
So welcome, everyone. We're very pleased that you're joining us tonight at tonight's ILM Circle on Sufism, Virtue, Ethics, and Beauty. Our guest presentation tonight intends to correct certain notions around Sufism. My name is Michelle Marion, and I am a board member of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, and I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker tonight. Imam Omar Tawil is the assistant imam at the Islamic Community Center of Tempe and university chaplain for the Muslim community at Arizona State University. He has served as an imam, a youth minister, and a high school teacher in Chicago, Illinois, and in Hartford, Connecticut. Since 2018, Imam Tawil has resided in Tempe with his wife and 2 children. Just a little housekeeping. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. At the end of our guest's presentation, I will read the questions to our guest speaker, and we will answer all of those at the end of the presentation. So I welcome you all again, and I am going to hand it off to our guest speaker tonight. Welcome, Imam.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, everyone. Peace and blessings be upon you. I pray that everyone is doing well. I pray that everyone is in good health. And I pray that the peace and blessings of God be upon each and every single one of you. So, alhamdulillah, praise be to God. We begin in his name, and we begin by sending our peace and our blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him, and indeed upon all of the prophets whose legacy Muslims attach themselves to, including Jesus and Moses and Noah and Abraham. So, like the intro said, I'm here to kind of demystify the mystical, to remove the enchantment from what is supposed to be enchanting, and to sober what has left many people possibly drunk. So hopefully that will be a good intro to where I'm going with this. I'm going to be sharing my screen in a moment, but I wanted to take a moment to warn anyone here. The first image I'm going to show, if you want to move your eyes away from the middle screen, please feel free to do so. The reason why I'm letting you know is because I Googled popular images of Sufism, or the word Sufism, and I just put images, and one of them was a bit weird. So this is some of the things that I'm trying to correct and reorient many people's understanding of Islam and Sufism or Islam, because sometimes they're synonymous, sometimes they're viewed as antithetical, sometimes a Sufi is viewed as not a Muslim or a different kind of Muslim, whereas a Muslim is viewed as not ever possibly being a Sufi, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to just revisit the term, revisit its the people, the greatest figures behind it, at least those that I found in the popular image Google or a Google search, right? I found these people that were brought up in the images, and I was like, all right, great, let's talk about these guys, and that way we can use it as an educational experience. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment. We'll get ready. Here we go. Is it working? Can everyone see it? All right, cool. So we're here, ILM Circles. Welcome to a class on Sufism, virtue, ethics, and beauty, not excluding one or the other. So here are the popular images that I found on Sufism. The first one, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure some of you might know, has anyone ever heard of Omar Al-Khayyam? Muslims not included. Many Muslims have heard of him, but popularly, he was known, particularly in America, for his poetry and for a pack of cigarettes that was named after him, because there was a great association with his poetry and the mysticism behind it, and it became kind of connected with 1001 Nights and a lot of the mystic Shriners of the Medinan Temple and Freemasonry and the whole 20s, the roaring 20s fashion. right? Does anyone know images of the Roaring Twenties where the women are wearing turbans? Has anyone ever seen that? That actually came from what was considered fashionable in France in the 20s, and it was all about Sufi mysticism, right? You know, the fortune teller, the soothsayer, the spiritual master. So that's one of the images that showed up, was of Umar al-Khayyam, and it actually mentions one of his lines of poetry: "Yon rising moon that looks for us again, how oft hereafter will she wax and wane?" And this is something that they were using to promote cigarettes in the early 20s. After that, in the top middle, you see Whirling Dervishes, which is a very popular image associated with the term Sufism. You know, in Turkey, where the man spins and he's got a gown on, and he increases the speed with which he spins, and he's supposed to, or she is supposed to, enter a trance-like state. The bottom middle, the one that I've warned you about, has a man sticking an iron in his eye socket, and multiple people behind him doing that. And they're supposed to be, I'm only saying this because I'm familiar with it, they're supposed to be in an entranced state where they do not feel pain, right? They're in an entranced state where they do not feel pain. And then the most interesting image in my belief, right, is the last one, where I found a question: Sufism equals Islam? Question mark. Are Sufis Muslim? Is Sufism at all inherently Islamic, or is Islam in somehow connected to Sufism? And that seems to be a popular question even amongst Muslims today, and amongst those who find themselves attracted to or entranced literally with Sufi literature and mysticism. So with that, we'll be going on. I just wanted to show, this is what Google gave me. These are popular images, popular understandings or misunderstandings, popular tropes or stereotypes, or maybe things that people have attributed to Sufism that possibly is done by Sufis, but may then be misattributed to Islam, and vice versa, the whole relationship going in multiple directions. So I also went on websites like Reddit and other forums and asked for, or looked for, popular understandings of Sufism. I even Googled it and went on to Wikipedia. So the first and most popular response of what an understanding of Sufism is having mystical experiences. How was that defined? It was defined very vaguely as just being a mystical experience. But sometimes more specifically, people were saying becoming one with God, ecstasy. I don't know if it's natural or a pill. So nonetheless, someone feeling ecstatic, and one being in a trance. And then one also said entering altered states of consciousness. And that's when the discussion started turning to shrooms in many forums and in many places, where people were talking about LSD, you know, the 70s and 60s hype, right? You know, I'm tripping, man. I'm seeing some amazing things. And then they start, you know, getting more attached to nature and trees and the like. Another understanding was that it's expression of faith through dances and music, almost exclusively from what I have found. Other forms were commenting and even boasting that it's not rigid like the rest of Islams and Muslims. And indeed, many articles in mainstream media like the New York Times, the Telegraph, the Independent, and so on and so forth, had many articles talking about Sufis versus ISIS, and how ISIS are killing the religious minority of Sufis. And I was confused because I didn't know that they were a religious minority, but apparently that's an understanding, is that they are a religious minority in the Middle East, and they are not rigid like Muslims and Islam. I've heard others say, or I've found that others have said, that they are opposed to the Islamic legalist tradition and orthodoxy, so that they're considered to be heretics by Muslims. And one last and final one was that it is for the select elite, the PhDs of the PhDs. Your PhD makes you an elementary school student, but if you have this status of the intellectual elite, you are at the top of the world in whatever field you may be in, and therefore You are of the select. As in Arabic, in many texts would say, al-khas, right? The elect few, the elect people who have the correct understanding or who are capable of even understanding, whatever it is that they are talking about. So these are some of the popular images that I have shown. I'm not dismissing any one or the other, but I'm showing you what Google tells us and what people who've made it onto Google have told us. Does anyone wish that their comment or their reflection be forever memorialized on a Google search? I feel like it's a goal right now. Like, oh my God, I Googled something and I found something that I said. I'm the one that said it. I'm the one that said it. Who knows? That's just a side thought. So, who was the most famous figure of my Google search? Of course, the one, the only, the one that Muslims call Maulana, our sire, our master of spiritual experience and poetry, Jalal ad-Din Muhammad, which is never found online unless you go through autobiographical material. People only say Rumi, but imagine if everyone started quoting him as Muhammad al-Rumi, right? Rumi wasn't a name of him per se, it was a title, the Roman. So his name was Jalal ad-Din Muhammad, the Roman, right? Why did they call him the Roman? Despite him being, okay, that's a typo, not born in Balkh, but born in Balkh, which is modern day Afghanistan. So he's Afghani, possibly Pashto. I don't know, but he wasn't born in Rome. So why does he have the nickname the Roman? Because he was in Eastern Europe. Because he was in Turkey before the development of the Ottoman dynasty. He was in Eastern Europe, what was still called by most people of that time, Rum. He's in Rome. He's in the Roman lands. So when he settled there and became a famous qadi, which is a judge of law, he was a very profoundly famous judge of law and a theologian. And he unfortunately becomes only famous for his poetry. None of his theological works or his legal excerpts are really reserved in history, but he's famed for his poetry. But again, Jalal ad-Din Muhammad al-Rumi was born in modern day Afghanistan, died in the 13th century, and was a famous jurist, a legal scholar of Islam, and a theologian. He becomes famous for his poetry, and of course, anyone who's read Rumi either in the native tongue of Farsi, or if they read Arabic translations, or if they've even read him in English, it's quite interesting and quite beautiful and quite profound. And oftentimes, unfortunately, we see almost no mention of an Islamic background or an Islamic connection whatsoever in most translations or in most representations and depictions. I heard a rumor down the Hollywood grapevine that there was thoughts of producing a movie on Jalal ad-Din al-Rumi, and he was to be played by Leonardo DiCaprio. I hope that doesn't get made. Hopefully they can select someone who, I don't know, would be more authentic to the image of where Jalal ad-Din al-Rumi was from, his heritage, his culture, and even, I guess you say what he may have actually looked like. God knows, maybe he does look like Leonardo DiCaprio. I have no idea. Moving on, the second person, the man that I told you, the cigarette box, right? Omar's cigarettes, not my cigarettes, Omar Al-Khayyam, born in Nishapur. Who knows where Nishapur is? Do I have a volunteer? Volunteers? Any volunteers in the chats? I can't see the chat, so if anyone wants to let me know if the chat participates, that's excellent. So we have Omar Al-Khayyam, born in Nishapur, dying in the 12th century, was quite famous, and I would say arguably with Muslims or within the Muslim tradition, he is more famously known as a mathematician, a philosopher, an astronomer, and then lastly, as a poet. And it's interesting, though, that the only representation I found of him in my searches in popular forums or on YouTube videos was that of a poet. He was actually famed with developing Copernicus's model of the universe or of the galaxy before Copernicus. And there's a lot of documentation on his contributions to astronomy and astrophysics. And it's quite phenomenal that he was doing this in the 12th century without being labeled as a heretic or someone that was to be sidelined. Instead, he meets the next person we're about to talk about, and they apparently had a good friendship. The next person is quite arguably the most orthodox Muslim figure in all of Muslim history, aside from the Prophet and the companions. And it is a man by the name of Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, who was born in Tus, which is a modern-day city in Iran, and he dies also in the 12th century, a few years before our previous slide, Umar al-Khayyam. Now, the meeting that actually existed between, or the meetings that existed between Al-Ghazali and Umar al-Khayyam revolved around Imam al-Ghazali's theological works and Umar al-Khayyam's works in astronomy. Most notably, his model of what he thought the galaxy was like. And Imam al-Ghazali, who was, I guess you can say, the standard of Muslim orthodoxy of his time and today, was like, cool, let me see how you develop this theory. Let's keep it moving. That's amazing. No rejection, no sidelining, just like, wow, that's awesome. So you have Imam Al-Ghazali, also known as a polymath, a legal theorist, or a jurist, a theologian, a philosopher, and a logician. Polymath, master of multiple disciplines, but he was most commonly known after the fact for his revival after a crisis. And to keep it very short, I think I'll delay this one. Should I delay this point? I'll delay this point. Spoilers. I'll delay it. I'll reverse it and then I'll delay it. So he's known for a revival after a particular crisis in his life, but for the majority of his life, he's known as the polymath, the brilliant mind, and nothing more. The brilliant mind, the jurist, the legal theorist, the philosopher, the logician, the theologian, the prolific author. A majority of his life, that's what he's known as. So I have a point here that I wanted to show, and that was about Islamic scholarship, and that the biggest promoters of Sufi practice, or of the understanding of Sufism, contrary to what is popularly displayed in my Google search, they were the top, the top echelon of scholars in whatever discipline that they were focusing on, or the multiple disciplines that they were focused on. Each were also attached to either institutes of higher learning and research, or they were put into positions of Islamic authority. So why I say this is because of a popular understanding, if you remember, that was over here, that Sufis, or people who practice Sufism, are opposed to Islamic legalism and orthodoxy. And they are not, quote unquote, rigid like the rest of Islam and Muslims. And that these figures, these historical men, these historical figures should not be connected to these popular understandings that you can find very easily in articles, news articles, in forums on multiple different websites, on YouTube videos, and even in Wikipedia entries, or at least parts of Wikipedia entries. Wikipedia does a decent enough job, at least according to me, but who am I? Anyhow, so the Islamic scholarship were often the biggest promoters of what we are talking about today, which is Sufism. So deliverance from error. Okay, remember I said that thing about Imam Al-Ghazali? He's most famous for the last one. He's known for his revival after a crisis. So the revival is exactly this, a book called in Arabic, Ihya Ulum ad-Din, the revival of the religious sciences. And he writes another book, an autobiography of how he wrote this book, in a book called al-munqidh min al-dalal, or deliverance from error. And what is the great error? What is the great crisis of Imam Al-Ghazali's life? His brother was a very well-known Sufi, very well-known poet of his time, Hamid Al-Ghazali, whereas Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali was known as an academic, a brilliant, sharp mind. I want you to imagine that a man or a woman in their mid-20s becoming the dean of faculty at Harvard. That is the life of Imam Al-Ghazali. At a very young age, he gets the premier chair at the premier university of the entire Islamic world, arguably the entire world at his time. Brilliant mind. And he's famously known for absolutely decimating anyone who dared argue with him or have a debate with him or try to put their interpretation over his. And he was very celebrated for that. It made him a very wealthy person. It also made him the enemy of many powerful people, but he was protected because of his status with the Muslim authorities of that time. They liked him. They found him to be a force to be reckoned with in the intellectual world, which would then trickle down to the political world as well. Does anyone here argue that the prowess of your academic achievements in a country translate to your prowess in the political arena as well, in the economy, in the development of a national identity? They're all connected. The university is far more powerful than most people know. I remember in Harry Potter, Dumbledore, Sheikh Dumbledore, Dumbledore says something quite interesting where he tries to remind the students at his school that at the end of the day, the most dangerous weapon of Voldemort is you, the students, of his manipulation of your learning or of your capacity to grow and develop. If he gains any footing in that, that is the most dangerous weapon that he could ever possess. The young minds seeking knowledge, seeking wisdom. So Imam Al-Ghazali is this brilliant man. His brother, Hamid Al-Ghazali, walks into one of his classes when he's preaching or teaching, and he kind of, for the lack of a better term, calls him a hypocrite. He says, you have this, basically I'm paraphrasing, you have such a brilliant mind, but your heart is numb. You're spiritually bankrupt. And Imam Al-Ghazali's crisis is that he began to feel that spiritual bankruptedness of his own soul. And it began to pull him deeper and deeper into a form of depression, but to the point where he could not speak, he could not eat, till he finally leaves all of his riches. He finds his brother and his other families to take care of his wife and children, and he travels on a physical journey, but also a spiritual one. And the book, or the result of his spiritual journey, is this: the revival of the religious sciences, where he promotes four main themes or four main concepts. Number one is that he argues that behind everything Islamic, or behind every religious devotion, is a spiritually significant meaning, is an experience that is to be had. And he categorizes the book in four main categories. Everything can be deduced to an act of worship, a disciplined habit, a destructive vice, or a saving virtue. Right? And this is where he then argues, this is what needs to be promoted behind all Islamic practice and education, a overwhelming and profound push for virtue and ethics. That if that is not behind my religious practice, the way it was before when he was having his crisis, then we are spiritually bankrupt. So this is where Imam Al-Ghazali, the famed theologian, the famed jurist, the famed philosopher and logician, is now known as a famous Sufi. And it's very interesting because at the beginning of his academic career, he did not like Sufis. For one reason, he couldn't argue with them. Because he says, I have studied every field of knowledge and I have argued with them and either destroyed it as an invalid field of knowledge or verified it as a valid discipline of academic inquiry. He says, but the Sufis, they speak how I speak, but they claim something else. They claim something that can neither be verified nor can be denied. They claim that this knowledge that even I possess, this religion that I practice, these rituals that I participate in are supposed to take me somewhere. They're supposed to take my spirit, figuratively, somewhere. And he didn't like it because he didn't have the experience that they were talking about. He couldn't confirm, nor could he deny. And Imam Al-Ghazali reaches a point where he doubts that they're even telling the truth until he has his crisis, until his brother shows him the error of his ways, and until he goes out in a way and starts practicing his faith experientially with a valid intention, not just doing it because I know it. And he has an experience that he then documents, which is found in this book. And he actually says something at the end of one of his biographies, or his autobiography, where he says, I was not in need of spiritual instruction or religious instruction. I was the scholar. I was the authority of my time, arguably to this time. I needed a spiritual experience, which I was very much lacking in all of my actions of worship or in all of my understanding and in my academic inquiry and so on and so forth. Moving on. Where am I going with this? Well, in order to go where am I going with this, I need to share an important quote by Rumi. Do you think I know what I'm doing? That for one breath or half a breath, I belong to myself, as much as a pen knows what it's writing or the ball can guess where it's going next. I don't know where I'm going. Where am I going with all this? What am I doing here? What's going on? Existential crisis. But these, again, brings me to this. What is the purpose of Sufism? Where does it come from? What is it supposed to do? Where is it supposed to bring the person? And it brings us very quickly and very easily back to the Quran, where God Almighty says in the Quran, هَلْ جَزَاءُ الْإِحْسَانِ إِلَّا الْإِحْسَانِ. Is there a reward for goodness? Is there a reward for excellence other than excellence itself? This is the, I guess you say, crux of the matter, the soul of the matter. And in order to go over the word ihsan, even in the Arabic language, we have to visit the very famed Hadith of the Archangel Gabriel. What this Hadith is about is that the second Caliph of Islam narrates, and he says, one day we were sitting with the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and in came a man that none of us recognized, and we're in a small town, a man who clearly did not look like a traveler, so it's strange that this guy's even entering our tent in the gathering of a private gathering, clearly. And he sits very close to the Prophet. He puts his hands on his thighs and he asks him, what is Islam? And the Prophet tells him about Islam. And he says, well, you have spoken truly. And at first, everyone just pauses and is like, okay, this is weird. And then he asks him, tell me about Iman. And he tells him about Iman, or what Muslims translate as faith, belief. And at the end, when the Prophet talks to this man about belief, the man said, you have spoken truly. And then the companions comment to themselves internally, and the narrator of this story comments, he says, we were astonished that he was questioning the messenger and then telling him he was right. Which, if you think about it, is quite insane. When was the last time you asked the teacher, hey, what does this mean? Yeah, you're right. I confirm. I can concur. I am confirming that you are a knowledgeable person, even though you're the teacher. So they found it to be odd until he finally begins to ask, inform me about ihsan. Tell me about beautiful excellence. And the messenger of God answers him and he says, it is that you should worship God as though you could see him. For though you cannot see him, you know that he sees you. This is what he defined ihsan as: spiritual excellence, virtue, ethics. Is that, are we going to be as virtuous or as ethical or as practicing or as devout in public as much as we are in private? Is it going to be consistent, or is it going to be for show? Are we going to be like Imam Al-Ghazali, where we are faithful followers and faithful defenders so long as it gets us fame and celebrity? Are we going to use it to achieve, through our own brilliance, posts of influence and power and prestige? Are we going to rely on our own understandings, the own prowess of our intellect, or are we going to be people who are reliant upon God, cognizant of God, of his watchful gaze upon us? And are we going to be as virtuous, as ethical, and as beautiful in our practice in private as we are in public? This is the traditional understanding of ihsan by all Muslims. And it becomes the bedrock of Sufism. That the goal of Sufism, the objective of it, is to worship God as if you see him. As if you see him. And although you cannot, you have a cognizance that he is ever watchful over you. And how do we see this? We see this elsewhere in the Prophet's teachings, where the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is talking to his young cousin, Abdullah ibn Abbas. He says that one day, I was riding behind the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and he said to me, young man, I will teach you some words. Be mindful of God, and he will take care of you. Be mindful of him, and you should find him at your side. If you ask, ask of God. If you need help, seek it from God. Know that if the whole world were to gather together in order to help you, they would not be able to help you except if God had written it so. And if the whole world were to gather in order to harm you, they would not harm you except if God had written so. The pens have been lifted and the pages are dry. So here we even see an element of ihsan, or an element of the teachings of Sufism found in the words of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. We have the surrender, which is inherent in Islam, reliance upon God. But what else do we have? Be mindful of God. Be mindful of God and God preserves. Ask and God answers. Turn to God when you seek help and aid shall be given. But know that there's no true performer or actor behind the workings of the universe other than God. This is the teaching. And if many of us were to go back and read Rumi's poetry, we begin to see some of this thought or this philosophy clearly written in there. That he was seeing something or experiencing something that was he was trying to show us through poetry. He was trying to show us this dependence that we have on God, this appreciation for beauty, this preservation of what God has created. However, it's also, depending on how we translate Rumi, a message of preserving the rights that God has given us and for us, the commandments of God and the prohibitions as well. We also have advice that is given from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, where he says, be conscious of God wherever you are and follow the bad deed with a good one to erase it and engage others with beautiful character. You know, when we speak of this part right here, this part of ihsan, I always teach children, how do you imagine, or how do you even live like you see God? It is that you should worship God as though you could see him. I teach it to children and I find it very effective. I tell them, imagine everything that you do, and everywhere you go, your mom is right behind you. And then they go like, oh. oh yeah, I'll be on my best behavior at all times. I was like, there you go. Even as a grown man, imagine everything you do. Even as a grown woman, imagine everything you do. Your mother's in the room there with you. How are you going to behave? And you're just like, huh, okay, I understand. I understand now. It's to have this ever mindful presence of God, to be forever mindful of God's presence in your life. And finally, the Prophet's advice: be conscious of God wherever you are. Follow the bad deed with a good deed, and erase it, and it shall erase it, and engage people with beauty. How beautiful will our character be if we knew our mom was watching? Will we get angry? Will we get upset? Will we have these, episodes where we lose our patience? Not only that, what kind of worshiper will we be if we know that God, and we are mindful that God's gaze is upon us right now? This was the entire purpose of Imam Al-Ghazali's works. If we go back, if we look at it, the sections about acts of worship and how they are to be translated into our lives, disciplined habits to increase our awareness or to increase our spiritual, vibrance. If we were to have destructive vices that get in the way of between us and God and our experience of God, how do we get rid of them? And what saving virtues can we rely on when hope might be lost? These are the things that these famous scholars, particularly Al-Ghazali and Rumi, were writing about, either in their poetry or in their intellectual works. Whereas, how do we form a system of teaching Islam, not only legally and as orthodoxy, not only when it comes to orthodox beliefs and legal do's and don'ts, but how do we adopt what we believe from orthodoxy, and how do we adopt what we do from the Islamic tradition, and how do we infuse that to look like what the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was speaking of himself? Because he makes an argument through his book. I'm a Muslim, I'm a scholar, and I missed it. And I'm looking at the words of God, and I'm looking at the virtue and the ethics and the ethos of the character of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And I kind of missed this instruction. I missed this experience. So what he basically does is that from the void that he experienced, he begins to formalize what it is. He takes the Sufis and he's like, look, you guys are awesome, but you're not relatable to anyone. Right? Imagine if Yoda starts coming in and blabbering to all of us and we're expected to know what Yoda is saying. If you look at Luke Skywalker, he's constantly listening to Yoda. He's like, I hear you. I just have no idea what you mean. Like, I hear what you're saying, but you have this mystic language that I have to decipher every time you speak, and it's difficult or impossible. So what Imam Al-Ghazali does is like, let's take what I write about as a scholar, what I explain, and let's fuse it with what is always in between the lines of revelation, with what is always in between the lines of what the Prophet says. And often enough, it's not in between the lines. It's right in front of us. It's not in between the lines. It's advice that the Prophet and a teaching the Prophet, peace be upon him, gave to his own cousin, to his own friend. It's not in between the lines. It's quite apparent and literal. Be conscious of God wherever you are. Follow the good deed with the bad one, and it'll erase it. And engage people beautifully. Interestingly, the Arabic, it uses the word hasan, which is the root word of the word ihsan. And ihsan is the study or the practice of virtue ethics, which is Sufism. The reason the word Sufism becomes adopted is for another day and another time. It's a very long one, a long history of how words become adopted and how they mean. So what is the purpose of it all? What should it eventually lead us to? We said that popularly it was an experience of the divine, a oneness with God. These are all true. But you see a hadith of the Prophet where the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, says that it was reported that a man had come to him and he said, "O Messenger of Allah, direct me to an act which if I do it will cause God to love me and the people to love me." So he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, renounce what the world wants and Allah will love you, and renounce what people possess and people will love you. So we have beautiful character and we have a renunciation of the vices of the world. We have beautiful character right here. The man treating that cat oh so beautifully. That's in Turkey, by the way, and that happens every day. If you want to pray and all of a sudden have a cat walk up to you in the middle of your prayer, believe me, a cat will be there in Turkey. And it's to renounce the temptation, to renounce the vices of this world and everything in it that would stray you or that would take you away from the worship of God, from a relationship with God. It will quite literally, sorry, where was it? So we have here, going back, popular understandings of Islam. Which ones can we confirm and which ones can we deny? Mystical experiences, check or no check? Let me get a popular vote. Check. Oneness with God, entering altered states. Sure, if you get them. You know, some people get them, some people don't. What about dances and music? I'm sure there are Sufis somewhere who are dancing and listening to music, maybe. Not rigid like the rest of Islam and Muslims. No, the pioneering Sufis were the most Muslim, as Muslim as you could get in terms of what they did and what they wrote and how they understood the world and what perspective they had, both on what was permitted and not permitted, opposed to Islamic legalism and orthodoxy. Everyone I've mentioned is arguably orthodox, right? With the exception of Umar al-Khayyam, because he was not known as a Muslim scholar. He was known as a scholar of other sciences, right? So, but opposed to legalism, what's his name? The dude, this guy, Rumi, the popular man, was a qadi. He was a judge. He was one who issued legal rulings as a profession. That was his job. His job was to have fatwas, verdicts, concluding certain legal cases and trials. And is it only for the select elite? No. It's for the young, it's for the old, it's for the learned, it's for the ignorant, it's for the devout, it's for the saints and the sinners, it's for anyone who can simply find themselves turning to Allah. It is for anyone who can say that I followed the advice, I am mindful of God. It is for anyone who can say, I follow my good deed or my bad deed with a good one so that it can erase it. And I engage people beautifully. I follow the commandments of the Prophet. I follow the commandments of God. And I also do my best to renounce the temptations of this world. I do my best to renounce what everyone is after and chasing that deludes them from their mission, from their objective and their purpose in life, which is to be one with God, which is to please God, to have that experience. And finally, it is to engage God and his creation beautifully. Love calls everywhere and always. We're skybound. Are you coming? Now, I will say that the skybound in Farsi is actually talking about paradise. We are paradise bound. Are you coming? This is what Rumi was calling to, a higher state of consciousness, a higher state of being, a higher state of virtue, of ethics, and especially of recognizing beauty. That's the thing that comes at the end. After you've had that mystical experience, right? After you've had that amazing trance-like experience that can never be replaced, then Rumi argues from his poetry, then you have the capacity to see beauty. Then you have the capacity to understand love. In other words, there's a verse of the Quran that I wish I could end on, where God Almighty says, فَأَيْنَ تَذْهَبُونَ? إن هو إلا ذكر للعالمين. Where then are you going? It is but a reminder for those who seek to be guided. لمن شاء منكم أن يستقيم. It is a reminder unto the worlds, amongst the people of the worlds who want to be guided aright. So that's it for today. I hope there are questions, comments, and so on and so forth that we can engage with.
Thank you, Imam. That was quite illuminating, and I loved the popular culture references too between Star Wars and Harry Potter. I'm sure that your students of all ages appreciate it too. So we have several questions that have come in the chat, and a few of them are kind of a historical basis. So we'll start there perhaps. So were the Crusades a factor at the time of the development of Sufism?
So the development of Sufism is much earlier than these figures. These were just the figures that I've picked from Google searches, right? These were the most consistent and the most prolific images or people that were mentioned. Sufism does find its traces back to the earliest of Muslims, including some of the companions. This is where it's another different topic, where does the word Sufism or Sufi come from? Or as a comment by Brother Ahmed in the comments, that tasawwuf is the original word from which Sufism or Sufi derives in Arabic, which is an Islamic term that is used as early as the first generation after the Prophet. So the Muslims that immediately succeeded the companions, they were using this term and they were engaging with it. I only used these scholars because this is what is most popularly referred to on the internet and easily accessible. But were the Crusades a factor for the life of Imam Al-Ghazali? Very much so. To the extent, Imam Al-Ghazali, when he's on his retreat from worldly life and its distractions after his crisis, when he's on his trip of spiritual revival, he actually encounters the Crusaders. He was actually in Jerusalem before it fell, and when he left to return to his family, Jerusalem falls. And when he dies, the Crusaders are very much a problem in the Muslim world. And it's interesting. Does the whole thing have to be recorded?
I'm going to leave that up to Asra and Joe because they're the producers.
So anyhow, I'm fine. I don't mind. It's something that is not popularly held, but after Imam Al-Ghazali, you do have the formalized development of what is called Sufi tariqas. Before him, Sufism was loose, right? It was, oh, I went to that sage, and I went to this master or this master. I went to her and I went to him, and I compiled all of this wisdom, and it's for me individually. But what Imam Al-Ghazali was arguing for in his book, The Revival, was that it needs to be formalized. It needs to be formalized, and it has to have kind of an equation. Here, plug this person here, plug him into this instruction, give him these experiences, share with him these teachings, and it should develop a virtuous, ethical Muslim. It should develop someone's spirit. So after Imam Al-Ghazali, quite literally, during his life, the first Sufi tariqa or Sufi order is developed. It's developed by a man named Abdul Qadir Al-Jilani, a very popular person in Islamic history, scholarly tradition as well. I'll type his name in the comment section.
Thank you.
Abdul Qadir al-Jilani formalizes the first Sufi order, which is primarily with two types of people, because that was his personal focus. Those in government, it wasn't to gain favors, believe me. He was like, you're corrupt. He's like, get over here. And he was someone who didn't enjoy wealth and military personnel because of how much he was concerned with oppression, unjust practices of people with power. Of course, he had a bunch of other non-government officials, non-military personnel with him in his circles, but he was focusing on reforming people who have responsibility in the public sphere. How do we reform politicians? In fact, there's a very famous story that the caliph of the time comes to him and offers him gifts of gold. And I'm going to paraphrase the story. He throws it in his face and he says, "You expect me to accept the blood of Muslims? You can't buy this gathering. This is not a gathering of men and women that you can purchase." Like, shoot, the most powerful man in the Muslim world, he told him, "Get out of my face." You know, imagine if the president of the United States, Biden, Trump, whoever, doesn't matter, just the position, the president of the United States comes up to us and is trying to get in on our good side and tries to pull for us political favors. Are we going to be like, "Get out of my face. I don't want to see you"? Even if we despise the president, we're probably going to have some level of decorum, right? Like, "Oh, I disagree with all of your policies." He was like, "Oh, get out of here." And he even says, "The only reason I'm even taking it light on you, my treatment of you, is because you're a descendant of the Prophet. Peace and blessings be upon him. Because you have attachment to his lineage." He's like, "If you didn't, I would have wiped the floor with you." He's like, "I would have been so much more rude and crass." So you have Imam Al-Ghazali. While he's alive, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani is alive. But Imam Al-Ghazali dies very early on. Abdul Qadir al-Jilani formalizes Sufi orders or practices of this education. What he then does is he develops very important people, namely a man by the name of Imaduddin Az-Zangi, a Kurdish general who meets Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, studies with him, and quite literally becomes the first Muslim in that era and in that time to try to unite Muslims to defend themselves, not against each other, but their crusades. Imaduddin al-Zangi is succeeded by his son, Nuruddin al-Zangi, right? The light of religion is his name, al-Zangi, which is the name of his family name, who's also Kurdish, who then, for the first time, collects more than 3 provinces of the Muslim world that had been broken up into schisms by the Crusades and by the infighting of Muslims. He unites more than 3 provinces, and indeed unites almost all of Syria and Lebanon, what is modern day Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, under one just command. Finally, you then have a very famous name that most Muslims will know, was Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, the man who is famed to unite Muslims all over the Middle East, through Central Asia to North Africa, before he then confronts the Crusaders, and who so graciously says, who the Crusaders and the Europeans said, "We were embarrassed by his chivalry, even of the enemies of him, even to the people who killed his sister in a very gruesome and cruel way, his sister who was defiled by these men. But when he came, he's like, I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here to take what is ours, our city. I'm here to free it from your reign and the terror." And he then offered anyone who couldn't afford to go back to Europe, he's like, "We will pay for you. We won't kill, we won't take any prisoners, we won't, harm anyone. You have my promise of your guaranteed safety." So then you have quite literally less than a generation after the death of Imam Al-Ghazali, people being impacted by his works on the ground. People being impacted on the ground to the point where the connection is clear. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi never met Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. His cousin did, who was Nuruddin al-Zangi, his older cousin. And his uncle did, Imaduddin al-Zangi, who met him, studied with him, lived with him, ate with him, and so on and so forth. To correct myself, there's debate as to whether or not Salahuddin met Sheikh Abdul Qadir or the al-Jilani, who was then someone who took the works of Imam Al-Ghazali and implemented them. So you have an impact and a very important need during the time of Imam Al-Ghazali to develop this formal education because of the Crusades. And Imam Al-Ghazali also writes about it. He writes about that the Crusades are going to change the world as we know it. And it's going to make people it's going to cause people to fall into despair. It's going to cause an even greater pandemic or epidemic of a loss of ethics and a loss of virtue and a loss of hope in God. So this was his effort in combating what I guess you could say would be the effects of terrorism or the effects of shock and awe of war and famine and destruction being spread, right? This was his way of dealing with it. And Rumi also lives during the time of the second wave of the Crusades. So he encounters them as well. And again, when you're living around all of that chaos and destruction, what better thing to do than to trying to find and communicate any little beauty that you have? This is what these men were driven by. And if anyone wants, there's a really beautiful person that you guys can look into. Her name is Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, and she is quite possibly one of the earliest figures in Islamic spirituality, or as we now know, Ihsan, or as we also know popularly as Sufism. She is a follower of the companions, meaning she met the people who lived with the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And she's considered one of the foremost poets and developers of Islamic spiritual practice, and was considered a legal scholar in her own right. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to a very short question.
No, it was fascinating, and I think it clarified quite a few things. So one of our guests has asked that you post the name of the two books that you've referenced in the chat, so that we can walk away and perhaps purchase those.
So I said
and then there was a question early on that came in from another of our guests. And it relates to what you were just discussing. Judy asks, don't you think that these great men became Sufi when they realized that they needed humility and not just elevated self-regard in their lives?
Most definitely. Rumi. So what's interesting is that particularly Ghazali and Rumi, and even to a degree Khayyam, but Khayyam was not known again as a religious scholar, but Rumi and Ghazali did not like Sufis in their early career. They thought them as irrational. They thought them as people of just, they considered them like monks, right? Like monasteries. And anyone who knows something about the Islamic tradition is that it's very frowned upon to live a monastic life intentionally in the Muslim world. It's like, no, you're meant to go and you're meant to be impacted and impact the society in a positive manner. The Prophet quite literally in some statements spoke against monasticism. And even in the Quran, it speaks against monasticism. It's that like, how easy is it to be faithful when you're not tested? That's the logic. How easy is it to be very faithful and very spiritual when your ego is not put to the test consistently? So it definitely was. And they all had teachers. For instance, there's a very beautiful book, which I will put here. It's a fictional work, a historical fictional work. It's called The 40 Rules of Love by, I think, Elif Shafak, I believe. In any case, it's a story about the teacher of Rumi, whose name was Shamsuddin at-Tabrizi, also from Central Asia, Tabriz, right? Of modern day Afghanistan. Man, Afghanistan, they keep promoting these really, brilliant men and women of Islam. So Rumi was at one time very, it's not that they considered them to be heretics. It's just that when you say things based on experience to a person who does not have that experience, what does it sound like? It could sound like crazy talk. And that's what the Sufis were doing at the time of Imam Al-Ghazali and at the time of Rumi. But when Imam Al-Ghazali was like, What is that you're saying? Because his brother was one of them. What are you saying? Let me understand that. Oh, I see. I'm missing something. Although I have the library behind me and in my mind, I'm missing this small integral ingredient for the recipe that is supposed to be Islam. The Prophet wasn't just a brilliant man. The Prophet was empathetic. The Prophet was beautiful in his treatment of others. The Prophet was a Gnostic, someone who would enjoy spending hours in the night praying before his Lord, to the extent that one of the companions of the Prophet said, when people saw him for the first time, the Prophet Muhammad, they fell in love with him. They were shocked by him. Sorry, they were in awe. And anyone who spent time with him loved him. And then the companion says, the reason why the Prophet had such an effect on people was because he allowed himself to have such an effect from God, such an impact from God. That was the reason why people were so impacted by him. Peace and blessings be upon him. There was an earlier question I saw that I wanted to get to. Yes. Is there a prohibition in Islam against self-mutilation? Absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and then there was a question that has just come in recently, and I don't speak Arabic, so if I repeat it to you, it's going to be a hot mess.
I see it. And I see it myself. In the popular understandings of Sufism, you have becoming one with God. Do you mean wahdat al-wujud? Is wahdat al-wujud haram? Wahdat al-wujud referring to the oneness of being, which is a doctrine that is attributed to someone by the name of Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, but the man never used the phrase, the oneness of being. It was a phrase that gets developed years after his death in order to explain what he was trying to say. So there's also an understanding of Sufism that is misappropriately attached to it, which is that Sufism is like pantheism, or that this doctrine that she is talking about, wahdat al-wujud, or the oneness of being, as being a pantheistic indwelling, that God dwells in objects, and therefore can be justified. It could be justified that you can worship things because God dwells within it. That is not the understanding or the promotion of Sufism or the oneness with God. What one means when they say oneness with God is what the Hadith suggests of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is that you walk this world as if you see God everywhere. You walk this world, you worship God as if the reality of heaven, the reality of paradise, the reality of hellfire, the reality of angels, and everything in between is laid before you. That is what it means when the Prophet speaks of it, and that is what is meant when the Sufi figures that we've just gone over, or the Muslim scholars also speak of it, is that it's not a faith. It's not a question of faith. It's a fact and a certainty of life. And the Quran speaks to it in this way in Surah Al-Kawthar, right? That it becomes Aynul Yaqeen, certainty of eyesight, certainty of insight, certainty of mind, that these things are real. An example of where Sufis are headed or what they're trying to achieve can also be summed in a statement that is attributed to the cousin of the Prophet, Imam Ali, may God be pleased with him. He says, if the veils of the unseen were to be lifted before my eyes, it would not increase me in certainty. It's like, it'd be like, imagine if you could see angels right now. We'd be freaking out. Whereas Imam Ali saying, I'd be like, cool. Yeah, I knew it was there. Like, so what? Yeah, what did you think? What, are you shocked? That would be his reaction. His reaction would be at our shock and awe of seeing the unseen. Whereas Imam Ali would be like, I took that as a fact already. Like water is wet, right? The earth is dry. Like, how could you not believe this? Like, how are you shocked? That's where he would be shocked. So this is generally the objective of Sufism, which is actually the overall objective of Islam. So what we want to also do here is make Sufism integral to Islam. There is no Sufism without Islam, because it's a branch of practice. It's a branch of refining the heart, refining the intellect, refining the soul, thereby refining the human, refining the individual to be virtuous, to be ethical, and to be beautiful, and to see beauty, and to reflect it in the creation of God as God intended.
Yeah. Thank you. That was really beautiful. And I hope Judy is not upset with me, but I'm going to share a comment that she made just to direct a parallel. She said it's an interesting parallel that no man was to study Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, until reaching the age of 35 and being married. And it is always fascinating to be able to see parallels between various religions. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's really, really interesting to have that perspective.
There's a very interesting, cool part here. There's no age restriction necessarily on like studying like the spiritual sciences of Islam. And it's in fact, the habits are inculcated into children at a very young age, generally speaking, or ideally speaking. But there's a very interesting reflection that one could see in the Quran or in Islam, is that where the Prophet, peace be and blessings be upon him, says that all prophets except two, and anyone who can guess these two is awesome, reached prophethood at the age of 40. That they were not endowed with prophethood or messengership until they were an experienced individual. They've experienced, they got battle scars, right? they've been around the block 40 times. They've seen things, and they have an understanding of how much they know and how much they don't know. And you do also have a very interesting thing that you will see that most people tend to drop their fanaticism, or at least most people should, in that age, like 30 and older. And it's a cliche that I say this, but so many times my teachers, even when I'm studying things in law and theology and philosophy, would tell me, yeah, you'll get that when you're like in your 30s. I'm like, what an offensive thing to say. What do you mean I can't understand it now? And then when I get to my 30s, I'm like, oh. I was like, yeah, dang, okay. Yeah, all right. And then I call that teacher up. I'm like, man, you called it. you said it perfectly. Like, there's no way you're gonna get that until you have a kid. And then it's just like, well, what, you're saying that those of us without children can't understand? And it's like, yes, those of you without children cannot understand. And then that person gets a child, and then they're like, dude, single people, you're not going to understand this until you're married. What? Just because I'm not married, I can't understand? I'm like, yeah, just because you're married, you can't understand. Then you get married, and then you're like, oh my God, it's so true. So it's kind of this thing that Hamid Al-Ghazali, the older brother of Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, spoke to him, that kind of knocked him into his senses. He told the thing that is reported that he told his brother in front of all of his students when he humiliated him. He says, how long will you be a whetstone, yet you yourself will never be sharpened? How long will you sharpen these brilliant minds of these students, but you're as dull as ever? And it's what moved Imam Al-Ghazali to then basically be like, wow, I am not who I think I am. I kind of depend on myself when I should be depending on God. I kind of have a high opinion of myself when I shouldn't. Maybe there's an idolatry within myself. Maybe there's a sense of associating partners with God in me, and that's what's been blocking my spiritual frustration, my mental health or lack thereof, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And I don't know if everyone has noticed, but one of our guests has been sharing some other critical readings in the chat. So I encourage you to take a peek at those so that we can walk away tonight with having just teased this topic, and then we can dive deeper into it when we do some additional reading, and perhaps invite the Imam back, because he did tease us a little bit and said, I'm not going to really get into the origins. So I'm thinking there's going to be a part 2.
That's going to require a lot of academic research. I'm more than happy to, of course.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I want to thank all of our guests who took time out of their evening to spend with a very enriching lesson for all of us. And I do think that you have hit the nail on the head with kind of demystifying things. And that is really important for us to have a deeper understanding and be able to explain it to others when we're in conversation as well. So thank you so much for your time. And thanks all of you for attending tonight. We really appreciate your patronage.